thank you all for joining us this evening for the Haffenreffer Museum's annual Barbara A. and Edward G. Hale lecture with tonight's guest lecturer, Christina Kreps. I have just a couple of quick housekeeping type things to mention. So please note the exits on either side of the gallery, behind you and behind me. And there are two restrooms. They're both gender neutral. There's one on the first floor here, and then just up the stairs, there's a second one. And let's see. Please silence your cell phone if you haven't already, and please do stay for the reception after the talk as well. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to the Haffenreffer Museum's Associate Director, Christina Hodge, who will give some remarks and introduce Christina Kreps.
Thank you, Ariel. All right, good evening, everybody. As Ariel said, my name's Christina Hodge. I'm the Associate Director here at the Haffenreffer. My pronouns are she and her. I am a settler colonial museum anthropologist, and for the video in the future, middle-aged, glasses, brown hair, if anyone's trying to visualize me. Most of the time, I do my work at our Collections Research Center over in Bristol, which is in Wampanoag homelands, although I'm very glad to be visiting with you all here on homelands of the Narragansett tribe here in Providence, and also to be welcoming you to, as Ariel said, the annual Endowed Barbara A. and Edward G. Hale lecture. So this lecture series was established in 2003 to honor Barbara and Ed's numerous contributions to Brown University and to the Haffenreffer Museum. Edward G. Hale was Associate Dean in Brown from 1970 to 1989, and a really active member of the museum's Friends Board at that time. And Barbara is a former Deputy Director and Curator of the HMA and a noted scholar of Native American art and culture. She really put the Haffenreffer on the map by curating exhibitions, publishing catalogs on many of our significant collections. And she's also always been a strong advocate of research with and for Native American communities, represented by her book, Gifts of Pride and Love, Kiowa and Comanche Cradles, which was published by the University of Oklahoma Press in 2000. Barbara retired in 2002 after 33 years of service to the University and Museum, but she continues to serve as a valued member of our advisory board and really inspires us with her knowledge and wisdom. You can learn more about past events and endowed lectures on our website. We've also got a YouTube channel with recorded videos, and this video will be shared there eventually as well. So we really encourage everybody to do that. So, turning to this evening's event, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Christina Kreps from the University of Denver, where she is a Professor of Anthropology and Director of Museum and Heritage Studies, as well as Director of the Museum of Anthropology there. So Christina undertakes museum anthropology as both an academic field and an applied and public scholarship. She's focused especially on disciplinary histories and engaged contemporary practices in colonial and post-colonial context, which is basically everywhere. So she's got a quite broad interest. So alongside her work in the United States, Christina works collaboratively with international museum professionals to consider non-Western museum paradigms and cross-cultural curatorial approaches, and you'll be hearing a little bit about that today, as well as concepts of cultural heritage preservation. So Christina co-edits the series Museum Meetings with Richard Sandell of Leicester University at Routledge Press, and she has contributed many significant publications to her fields, our fields, including the 2020 volume Museums and Anthropology in the Age of Engagement, 2003's Liberating Culture, Cross-Cultural Perspectives on Museums, Curation, and Cultural Heritage Preservation. And also please watch out for the forthcoming co-edited volume from Routledge with me that we think will be published in the next year, called Pragmatic Imagination in the New Museum Anthropology. So Christina has been and is widely invited to speak on subjects related to her fields. She contributes to international museum development, professional training programs, is frequently found at conferences, shaping conversations around museum anthropology, and supporting the growth of young professionals, which is always really appreciated. Just last week, she participated in the American Institute for Indonesian Studies Museums for the 21st Century program, which brought together curators and scholars from the US and Indonesia to consider museum futures in these kind of global and cross-cultural perspectives. We are very glad she is joining us this evening in Providence to discuss productive affinities and frictions between museum practices of art and anthropology. So please join me in welcoming Professor Christina Kreps.
my interns from the side there. Okay.
Where is yours?
Kitty's. Okay.
Where's yours?
Isn't that it? Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Yay. Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you, Christina, and thank all of you for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. And I have to say thank you to Christina and Robert Purcell for inviting me to do this lecture. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be back here at Brown and the Haffenreffer Museum of Anthropology. I was last here in 2012, so it's been 10 years. And then also for the recording and for purposes, I'm an older middle-aged woman with sort of brown hair, glasses, and what else? And I am from the land of the ancestral territory of the Arapaho and Cheyenne and Ute people, and 48 other affiliated tribes of the Denver region, Rocky Mountain area. And so I want to acknowledge them and thank everyone from the past and today for making it possible for me to be here. So with that, I will begin, and just want to say that I've been following the museum, the Haffenreffer's work for a long time. And in fact, I used it in my recent book, Museums and Anthropology in the Age of Engagement, as an example of the kinds of initiatives that have been taking place in museum anthropology over the past several decades that have been really contributing to the field's revitalization and visibility, not only within the discipline of anthropology, but also in universities. And one of the purposes of the book is actually to provide a historical account of the shifting status of museum anthropology within academic anthropology, and to offer some examples of the contributions of this subfield in the past and in the present. So I know some of you are familiar with the history of museum anthropology or museum work within anthropology, that museums were the original homes of the field, one of their institutional homes, when material culture was at the center of museum work and theorizing. And then as time progressed and field work replaced a lot of, secondhand field work was about firsthand knowledge production. And anyway, museum anthropology receded to the margins of the discipline and had existed there for quite a while until relatively recently started to re-emerge. And in the book, I talk about how it's not just this rupture, nothing was happening, but actually things were happening, and we were just kind of this ebb and flow of a presence within anthropology, but more so with public anthropology and the role of the museum in the public sphere. So I argue that that we have sort of been regaining its standing in the discipline because it offers models for engaged research, scholarship, and practice at a time in which public, community, and cross-disciplinary engagement is at the forefront of anthropology and the museum world. In addition to making museum anthropology more visible and trying to build bridges across various subfields within anthropology, the book also acknowledges the contributions of museum studies as a scholarly discipline as well as a field of practice. Similar to museum anthropology, museum studies existed on the periphery of academia, also due to this kind of perceived image of it as being the how-to of museum work. But like museum anthropology, museum studies has been undergoing sweeping changes over the past several decades and assuming a prominence within the academy that it has not enjoyed since the beginning of the last century. So as the noted anthropologist and museum studies scholar, Sharon McDonald, wrote in the introduction to the 2006 Blackwell Companion to Museum Studies, museum studies has come of age. And this is largely due to, in her opinion and many others, has been attributed to a theorizing of the museum and everything that goes on in museums and the development of a new museum theory. So for MacDonald, museum studies is currently one of the most truly interdisciplinary fields in the academy, with contributors that include anthropologists, art historians, sociologists, cultural studies scholars, plus scholars from the natural sciences as well. So I'm going to read a long quote from hers because I think it really captures this moment for museum studies. So museum studies has moved from being an unusual and minority subject into the mainstream. Disciplines which previously paid little attention to museums have come to see the museum as a site at which some of the most interesting and significant of their debates and questions can be explored in novel and often excitingly applicable ways. They have come to recognize that understanding the museum requires moving beyond intradisciplinary concerns to creating dialogue with others, and to adopting and adapting questions, techniques, and approaches derived from other areas of disciplinary expertise. All of this has contributed to museum studies becoming one of the most genuinely multi and increasingly interdisciplinary areas of the Academy today. So Flora Kaplan, maybe some of you know her work, also an anthropologist and former director of museum studies at NYU, recognized back in 1992 that museum studies stands at new professional frontiers situated somewhere between universities and museums. So the Haffenreffer, in my opinion, has been exemplary in creating practices that break down and cut across traditional boundaries within and across disciplines and different fields of practice, particularly between art and anthropology and museum studies. And Stephen Lubar, is he here? Eloquently describes many of these projects and practices in this wonderful book, Inside the Lost Museum. And I think has been an inspiration of that mixing. The Haffenreffer and the work that's been done here is an example of this kind of cross-disciplinary work. So in this presentation, I'm also concerned with this kind of border crossing, and specifically with the intersections of contemporary art practice and anthropology and their convergence within the museological realm of the curatorial. I discussed the exhibit Each Other, Marie Watt and Kanupa Hanska Luger, on view at the Denver Art Museum from May to August 2021, as an example of curating across art and anthropology, and as an expanded view of curation as social practice. So ultimately, I suggest that as museums increasingly become hybridized intercultural spaces in which issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion are at the forefront, we are obliged to continually recalibrate our methods to adjust to the changing landscapes of museums as social and cultural institutions, and to imagine new and alternative approaches. So this process, I suggest, begins here in this space, as it is a very apropos exhibit here of curating across art and anthropology. It begins with how we educate and train students aspiring to work in museums and how to think through all these difficult, complex questions and challenging, but also very exciting things that are going on in and across the Academy and in the museum world today. So my thinking about curation as social practice presented here builds on ideas that I set forth in an article published in the journal Curator way back in 2003, titled Curatorship as Social Practice. In the article, I described changes that had been taking place in the museum world that had been pushing conventional approaches to curation in more socially engaged, holistic, and relational directions. The article offers a cross-cultural perspective on curating drawn from my work on indigenous cural practices in Kalimantan, which is Indonesian Borneo, and the roles and responsibilities of traditional caretakers, or what I saw as curators. I show how the curation of sacred and ceremonial objects and heirlooms is embedded in larger structures as religion and cosmology and kinship and social hierarchies and status. And my aim is to demonstrate how curating is a form of social practice that's linked to specific kinds of relationships between people and objects, as well as the wider material and immaterial worlds in which they live. I argue that while objects and collections have been the cornerstone of Western museology, it is the people behind the objects that bring them to life and give them fuller meaning through social interaction. So this kind of socially and culturally embedded curatorial practice is not far from what has become an expanded view of the curator and curation in contemporary art, anthropological and museological discourse and practice. In the introduction to the book, The Anthropologist as Curator, Roger Sanzi points out that the literature on the curatorial has exploded in the last few years, and that the words curator and curator have become all-encompassing. To Sanzi, the omnipresent figure of the curator today is that of the mediator, facilitator, and manager in charge of assembling art, concepts, people, installations, events, in addition to their conventional roles of acquiring, researching, caring for, and exhibiting collections. Philip Shork and Connell McCarthy, in the introduction to Curatopia, Museums and the Future of Curatorship, also discuss the expansion and transformation of the idea of curator and curating. They write that, quote, since the late 20th century, curating seems to be everywhere. Indeed, they say we might already be living in a kind of curatopia, given the ubiquitous use of the words curator and curating today. Maybe some of you have noticed that. So moving beyond collection care, they state that new models of curator have proliferated, which emphasize their creative agency. For example, curator as exhibit maker, project manager, producer, artist. In their view, the field of curator has shifted from a role requiring specialized connoisseurship to one that has more to do with public service, diplomatic management, and cutting-edge knowledge of the problems of contemporary society. Shork and McCarthy suggest that in studying Curatopia, emphasis should be placed on the ways in which culture becomes alive, how it is enacted and performed. They argue that both notions of enactment and performativity can help us better understand the figure of the curator in their role of reconstructing or creating culture and as meaning maker and relationship creator. They further stress that while acts of translation have always been at the center of anthropology, they are equally at the heart of contemporary curatorship. In their words, quote, Translation can be seen as a world-making process in which realms of experience are brought together. So the authors envision museums as profoundly cross-cultural spaces, as curatorship as a cross-cultural method. However, they take issue with the idea that cross-cultural encounters are per se something positive, neutral, good. As many of us probably know here that such encounters can also cause friction, further essentialization and othering, while idealizing one's own cultural grounding. They underscore the need to ask how hierarchy and authority are exercised and negotiated, how uneven power relationships are installed and legitimized, and how they are challenged, appropriated, and dealt with within the context of the museum. Overall, the book offers building blocks toward curatopia, which they claim is an ideal of socially and politically engaged, interdisciplinary, and radically cross-cultural curatorial practice. Curatopia gestures toward a commitment to cultural futures and is an approach to curatorship that deals not only with the past and present, but also with the future. So the expansion of our notion of the curator and the curatorial, Sanzi points out, has built on movements in contemporary art over the past few decades, particularly the genre of social practice or socially engaged art practice and relational art. Anthropologists have been interested in the ways in which these artists, social practice artists, have appropriated the methods and sensibilities of ethnographic fieldwork, and in how artistic practices might enlarge the range of work being produced within anthropology. Arne Schneider and Christopher Wright in the introduction to the book Between Art and Anthropology discuss how, quote, artistic practices can extend anthropological practices and vice versa, and encourage the kind of experimentation that can result in new and dynamic directions for both contemporary art practice and anthropology. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of these approaches, for example, relational art and relational aesthetics as a mode of art making codified by the cultural theorist and curator Nicolas Bourriard in his 1998 landmark text, Relational Aesthetics. According to Bourriard, relational art encompasses, quote, a set of artistic practices which take as their theoretical and practical point of departure the whole of human relations and their social context, rather than an independent and private space, end of quote. So relational art is akin to, or is sometimes seen as interchangeable with social practice art or socially engaged art, in that it also extends to and is embedded in social relations and public spaces. Stepping outside the gallery space, social practice artists have proposed explicitly social and political forms of work. The aim of their projects is not just to enact social relations, but to intervene in actually existing conditions and contexts to have a political and social effect. Relational and social practice artists are not just interested in the art product itself, but more so the things that we can do with art. Social practice art tends to be highly experimental, participatory, performance-based, open-ended, dialogical, and transformative in its approach. It frequently involves research or fieldwork that addresses issues of immediate social relevance and to particular groups. The intention behind much relational and social practice art is to bring people together, to make interventions or to perform actions around some common concern. Thus, collaboration, co-creation, and curation are foundational to this kind of work. Artists and curators can be concerned with creating and curating community as much as they are with curating art and exhibitions. The art historian and museum studies scholar Janet Marstein sees socially engaged artistic practice as a form of art that helps establish new relationships with others based on equality. It breaks down the boundaries, ideally, between museums and other institutions to imagine a more socially engaged future. It is a performative process with the potential to help museums shed elitist, proprietary modes of thinking. So respectively, social practice and relational art approaches are in step with current trends, calling for museums to exercise moral agency, to provide a platform for activism, and to be viewed in relational terms. So with that, I now turn to the exhibit, Each Other. Again, that was at the Denver Art Museum in 2021. Each Other was much more than an exhibit that presented the finished works of collaboration between two artists. In effect, it was about the permutations and possibilities of collaboration. As John Lukovic, an anthropologist, and Andrew W. Mellon, curator of Native Arts at the Denver Art Museum, put it in the exhibition catalog, while the works on display were tangible, more importantly, they were memories of collaboration that provide us with a model for coming together and taking part in something greater than ourselves. End of quote. Each Other focused on the artist's particular approaches to collaboration as an integral part of their creative processes as contemporary artists and their indigenous American cultural backgrounds. Based in Portland, Oregon, Watt identifies as a member of the Seneca Nation with German and Scottish ancestry. Born on the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, Lugar is a New Mexico-based artist and citizen of the three affiliated tribes of Fort Berthold and of Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, Lakota, and European ancestry. So when entering the gallery, this is the first thing that visitors see, these quotes from the artists that, speak to how they see their approach to art and art making and collaboration. For Watt and Lugar, art is a social project where people who participate in the making become invested, relationships are forged, and an exchange happens. This way of thinking about art as collaborative and a communal act, Lukovic emphasizes, is not new. For much of human history, art was an act of shared creation. Both artists conceptualize collaboration in broad terms. It is a process that involves many participants, including collaboration with their materials and the land and the animals that provided them, family and ancestors, and the work of artists and craftspeople that came before them. They are deeply committed to using what they call social collaboration and collaborative action to address and engage with social and environmental issues of concern within their communities, but also beyond them. As part of the exhibit, Watt and Lugar merged their practices to create this monumental she-wolf sculpture, also titled Each Other, with over 300 participants. Between February 2020 and February 2021, they invited collaborators to participate in virtual sewing circles and to embroider a word or message on a bandana-sized square of fabric that visualized a sentiment they felt during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown. The artists received over 850 pieces of fabric from people all around the world. And as stated in the catalog, Lugar and Watt wanted to bring audiences into some kind of tactile encounter, even though it was virtually, with critically relevant issues of protection, shelter, reciprocity, sustenance, exchange, power, stewardship, wildness, homelessness, kinship, vulnerability, and ferocity. In the gallery, the artist asked visitors to think about, quote, how acts of collaboration may help heal broken bonds with the environment and with each other. In addition to this piece, the exhibit featured 25 pieces created through each artist's own participatory projects that demonstrated how, in Lukavic's words, their art is rooted in and aims to produce activism and social engagement. Luger is well known for using his art as an instrument for activism, protest, resistance, and to create awareness of current issues. For example, this piece titled Everyone is prominently displayed right at the beginning of its exhibition. So this is what you see when you first walk in, and calls attention to the thousands of Indigenous women, girls, queer and transgender people who have gone missing or who have been murdered in Canada and along the US-Canada border. Everyone consists of 4,000 fist-sized ceramic beads, and each bead represents a missing or murdered person. For Everyone, he solicited beads from Indigenous communities through an online video post that included instructions on how to make the beads. Watt's work is also highly participatory and socially engaged, inspired by Indigenous and Euro-American communal practices of art making, such as sewing bees and quilting circles, as well as the social sculpture of the German artist Joseph Beuys. Watt has organized dozens of these kinds of sewing circles in which participants collectively create quilts and fabric collages intended to capture communal histories, struggles, and hopes. Watt is interested in how each person's stitch is an imprint, a signature, and how threads form webs that connect us. So she's the one in the red shirt. Each other also includes pieces from a body of work referred to as blanket stories that are the result of asking people, like this woman on the left, to contribute treasured blankets and their stories. The blankets become sculptures that reference trees, story poles of Indigenous carvers of the Pacific Northwest, and Seneca creation stories. One of the pieces on display, titled Blanket Story Confluence, Heirloom, and 10th Mountain Division, she created while she was an artist in residence at the Dam in 2013. Members of the Denver local community, including myself, gifted a blanket for the piece. And to each piece, you can see there's a tag attached that has the story of that particular blanket and what it meant to the person who gave it. And then over on the side, there was a table that had a book with a collection of all the stories and the tags, and so that visitors could not climb to the very top to see them, could see what they said. So Jamie Powell, an Osage Nation anthropologist and associate curator of Indigenous art at the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth University, in her essay in the catalog, stresses how Luger and Watt's work emerges from long-held communal practices of creating within Indigenous communities, informed by Indigenous epistemologies and aesthetics, such as the importance of place-based engagement, placemaking, and relationality. As Powell notes, in addition to providing a space for people to consider their relationships and responsibilities to one another as humans, Watt and Luger both interrogate human relationships to place and non-human beings. Here, Powell shares that relationality as a concept grounded in Indigenous knowledges represents a foundational element of their individual practices and a shared concept that is woven throughout their works and the works of many indigenous artists today. Powell draws attention to how the artists' collaborative engagements are rarely one-time events. Sustaining the relationships created and discussions that grow out of them are integral to their work. In the end, Powell suggests that Watt and Lugar are, quote, pushing the boundaries of collaborative practice and what sustained engagement in art and museums can look like. Their practice of social collaboration and collaborative action, rooted in indigenous understandings of place, materiality, and relationality, according to Powell, adds dimension to and unsettles some of what she sees are the neoliberal tendencies of relational aesthetics and social practice art that have become prominent in the contemporary art world. In fact, Powell points out that, quote, Watt and Lugar refuse Western art historical categorization and argue for a consideration of art as inseparable from our humanity. Given the deep roots of relational thinking and art making as a communal act, the artist, scholar, and member of the Cherokee Nation, Laura Evans, contends that, quote, it is possible to make an argument that socially engaged art and other cutting-edge developments have been long-standing practices in indigenous communities. The problem is merging specialized vocabulary from the rarefied art world with indigenous concepts and practices, end of quote. So the curatorial work behind each other was not just about assembling and presenting the creative works of two artists. It was about making connections among art, ideas, contemporary social issues, and people's stories. It was also about cultivating relationships and community, redressing historical wrongs and showing respect for diverse worldviews and belief systems. This approach to curatorship approximates Richard Curran's view of curation described in this slide from his book, Reflections of a Culture Broker, Views from the Smithsonian. So I'll just let you read that on your own. Exhibitions like each other prompt what Shelley Butler and Erica Lair call curatorial dreaming. In their introduction to their edited volume, Curatorial Dreams, Critics Imagine Exhibitions, they write that, quote, curatorial dreaming is engaged cultural analysis and critique, which aims to diversify our methods and engage with wider audiences through experimental, inclusive, critical, democratic, participatory, reflexive, multivocal, and socially relevant exhibition strategies. They see curatorial work as a methodology that embraces research analysis, cultural representation, creative expression, social intervention, and dialogue with broad publics. So in my teaching, I push students to engage in curatorial dreaming that extends beyond the boundaries of not only conventional museum practice, but also anthropology. I show them examples of how my own thinking and practice have been enlarged and enhanced by working with artists like Marie Watt and with several other social practice artists that we were talking about earlier. Daniele Pariopera was an Italian artist that I discuss actually in the book, Museums in Anthropology, Age of Engagement, our work in Italy and Denver, and then another German social practice artist. So over the years, I have examples to share with the students who sometimes are a little intimidated, the anthropology students, when you ask them to be creative and imaginative. But over the past few years, I've also initiated several projects to strengthen connections between the museum studies programs in anthropology and in the School of Art and Art History at my university, at the University of Denver, which have existed as two separate programs for at least 30 years. So my goal has been to encourage more interaction and collaboration among the faculty as well as among our students through cross-listed and co-taught courses and workshops and activities. Students have had the opportunity to engage in interdisciplinary learning as well as work together on projects. For example, last year, we co-curated and collaborated on the faculty and students from the School of Art and Art History and Anthropology on this exhibit, Future Fossils, the Art and Anthropology of the Anthropocene, which included the works of 9 faculty artists, and they showed their work in the Anthropology Gallery, which is here on the left. And then in another gallery, the Davis Gallery in the art building, we showed the work of 15 students. And that gallery is devoted, it's a community art lab for students to engage in community collaborations. So while challenges remain, certainly in bringing our programs together and bringing art and art history and anthropology together, my colleagues and I believe we have made progress in breaking down disciplinary boundaries, correcting outdated perceptions of what anthropologists, artists, and art historians do, and moving closer to common ground while recognizing the unique contributions of each field and what each has to offer the other. I do believe maintaining disciplinary heterogeneity is important, that different fields have different methods and theoretical frameworks and approaches to practice that can come to overlap and complement one another, not replace, but complement. We also have been concerned with helping students develop their capacities to be able to not only respond to the changing landscape of museums, but also shape it. So learning to curate across art and anthropology and see museum work more broadly as a form of social practice, I just hope or suggest that maybe that's a step in that direction. So with that, I say thank you. But if you want to look at those books for a little bit longer, you can do that too. So thank you for listening. And now I hope we can have thank you. And I wanted to phrase this as a conversation because I'm sure that you have some perspectives on the topic in terms of bringing different fields together and maybe where some of the tensions and frictions are. I didn't say a whole lot about that in terms of our experience at the University of Denver, but I just would really like to hear what your thoughts and experiences have been. Anyone? Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. Hearing you discuss so much about social practice and relational aesthetics and people coming together, I wonder what your thoughts are on institutions that may not have, or the introduction of institutions that don't have any collections, or the idea of a museum. Can a museum even exist without collections?
Mm-hmm. I think there are many examples of that. A lot, for example, the Contemporary Art Museum in Denver doesn't have collections, but they call themselves a museum. And it is very much an experimental space. And they have exhibits of collections and objects, but no, I don't think necessary. The conventional concept of the museum and the collections being at the core of a museum, but I don't think it's a prerequisite. I mean, I do think collections are extremely important and can be also the catalyst and starting point, and that object-based learning and teaching and learning, which the Haffenreffer has been very good at doing that, is extremely important, and it's so important to show across the disciplines and to administrators how rich these collections are and their potential and value for education and teaching and social practice. You know, I think this is an interesting exhibit in that it may not be performative in the way that we're thinking, but every object in here is performing, has a kind of agency if we give it or if we allow it to be expressed. So I think there are many ways to do the museum, to do museum work and curatorial work. Thank you. That's a good question. Mm-hmm.
Along similar ideas about museums that may not have physical objects, and how you facilitate kind of remaking the experience with that. But the idea of museums that can portray kind of the intangible cultural knowledge, like knowledge behind the making or the manufacture of an object, and how you kind of create those remaking experiences, and also give over, I guess, authority or control to the people who are more equipped culturally to understand that intangible knowledge. Do you have any examples or suggestions for that?
Well, that has been an area that I, back in, gosh, what year was that? 2005, I had a fellowship at the Smithsonian to study the 2003 Convention on the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. And so as a result of that, I ended up doing work in Thailand with a field school over 5 seasons that we did to train people from all over Southeast Asia to basically do ethnographic field work to study living culture and the knowledge and stories and experience that people had. And we did our field sites were community-based museums in monasteries. And it was very much about curating living culture and learning from the practitioners of weaving, raising silkworms and weaving and festivals and ceremonies and living cultural expressions. And so it was about collecting the stories and making videos and films about that living culture. And then also one of the big things I took away from that was that it never was even an issue to talk about, these museums happen to be in monasteries and where there were also temples, and people were bringing objects that they found in their fields when they were plowing that were charged and potentially dangerous. And they would bring them to the monastery for the monks to kind of nullify their potentially dangerous powers and to make it safe. And they would donate these pieces to the museum. I don't have slides in this presentation, but in others I do, of these long tables out in front of one monastery, and there was a canoe that had been excavated from a rice field. And it was a sacred object, and people thought, it's really animated. We better take this to the monastery. And it's just this beautiful photograph of flowers, and people are burning incense and showing respect for these ancient things taken out of the earth. So it was community curating and co-curating of the intangible, the spirits, and respecting and acknowledge that those need caring for big time, actually. So that's just one of many examples. Maybe I just love that story so much. I like to tell people about it, that there was no conflict between the sacred and the secular, how there can be here. That has been a friction. That it was perfectly normal because the monastery was a very old model of a museum. Temples and shrines, as many of you know, the word museum comes from temple, of the muses. So they didn't have an issue. I mean, that with it being a religious space in which to curate, because curator also comes from the word curate. So I don't know if that is okay. Okay. Yeah, cross-culturally, I like to call what I do is comparative museology. And in doing comparative museology, it throws into relief our own practices, right? So that we can see them in a new way, defamiliarizing the familiar is a common method in anthropology. And so we can see how, here, religion and the museum and the sacred and the secular sometimes are in conflict. NACPRA is a perfect example of science and religion. But in other spaces, no. It's not. It's kind of normal and natural. So I think comparative museology is a very important tool for that.
But I think going in maybe the other direction, the idea of many of us being taught, I guess from a young age, of museums like liminal spaces where you have to change behavior, change your perception, and even like change your understanding of space because the whole space dynamic is different. But then on the other hand, you see museums, or what for all intents and purposes can be considered museums, particularly for like the First Nations peoples. Yeah. It is a more secular space. I think a lot of museums that are run by Native American peoples are actually, they call them community centers, I think. So it's not a liminality, it's just kind of an actual congregated place.
Yeah, a place to come together. And for some people, the museum, that word is a very tainted word and brings up connotations that people do not want to be reminded of. So, yeah. All kinds of, a lot is very fraught, but there's also a lot of potential and provocative in these, if we can be curatorial, dreaming about other ways of doing things, alternatives.
Considering all the political narratives that have been projected onto museums as tools of diplomacy, do you think there is a way for these cross-national collaborations to really speak those national heroes?
For the cross-national collaborations to do.
These like national political agendas.
Well, there is. I'm participating in a program that's a multinational, multilateral initiative called Shared Heritage, and through the Netherlands and former Dutch colonies. And that concept of shared heritage is also very, can be very problematic, but at least it's gesturing toward trying to collectively address these dark and difficult heritages that the past, and how can we come together and help, through collaboration, international collaboration. And the last seminar that we had back in the fall was on stories and sharing stories about colonialism and decolonialism. And so I think I'm very, inspired by this, and also the Cultural Emergency Relief Fund and International Blue Shield that is trying to help people in times of disaster and war and the destruction of monuments and so forth, of international cooperation around these kind of restorative efforts. And so I think there's a lot of examples out there of these kinds of initiatives, and that it's not all just everybody is mad at museums and heritage. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on where people are truly trying to say, okay, yes, we acknowledge, we're not denying, but how do we move forward? And I see that a lot in Asia and places that I work, where people are very much committed to a future where imagining these other kinds of possibilities through international cooperation. And frankly, in so many places where like Vietnam and Thailand and Indonesia, the museums would not be able to survive, without help, international collaboration. And just in terms of, locally they can, but, it's like aid, international development aid. It helps, and it's a good thing. So that's my opinion. I think it's a good thing, and I think there are lots of really good projects going on. Mm-hmm. It's political, of course. There's a diplomacy element of it that people know it, like this seminar that I participated in last weekend. I was kind of shocked because the first slide that they brought up was this big American flag. Because it was the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta paid for these training programs, and I was like, wow, I didn't know they were still doing that kind of thing. So it was a surprise to me that, so even the U.S. Embassy is getting behind cultural diplomacy. I mean, they always have been. There's always been that element, but in new and different way and out of the way places like the middle of Borneo. So, yeah. Any other questions or just smelling food? And why need to get over there to the other side of the wall? Anything else?
Yes, with that,
Okay.
anything else? I mean, Christina will be here, so if you would like a less formal way to ask her a question or say hello or introduce yourself, please do that.
Mm-hmm.
But with that, please join me in thanking Christina again for her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.